From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 19. Roundeer Village, also known as the Rounds, the Pit, Human Hollow, Rabbit Town, or as its most common epithet, Rounderville, was in fact just a designation for the slums just outside the city walls. Its population makeup matched the demographics of the city itself, with the exception of a lack of anyone with elven blood. Elves may be the lords of Arathes, but this was one place where they were specifically not welcome. The name itself came from a pejorative joke that elves sometimes made to one another that goes something to the effect of, "Human lives are like their ears, short, dull, and pointless." Inane elven humour aside, the village itself was intended by the high-minded elites to be fair and humane accommodations for the thousands of non-elves who worked in the city doing back-breaking and often dangerous labour but made poverty-level wages. The elven bureaucrats and security officials, citing concerns about defence and environmental impact, required that the village must be limited to only semi-permanent structures. Buildings could not be higher than 1 story and be built with nothing stronger than wood. In the event of an enemy attack, they could disassemble or burn the village and leave the area open for city defences. The end result was a sprawling, muddy slum filled with crime and violence, run by gangs that even Fraenk avoided. It made perfect sense that the Kobold would hide out here. There's no way Arch-Preceptor Farathiel Gingerglade nor any of his posh goons could even get close. They'd be met by an angry mob that left nothing behind but the points of their ears and the tips of their boots. Which is why the conniving knave needed a foolhardy mercenary to go into the shanty town for them. "Arch Neversleep, sir. I can say with all certainty that this is a bad idea, and Brand knows I've held my tongue on plenty of ones previous to this. But I just got to say it." Nim trailed Fraenk by a pace as they clomped along the slightly raised planks that kept all the foot traffic out of the mud. A light drizzle began to fall, sending many of the residents indoors. Fresh rains or no, the streets in Rounderville always seemed like a mire, rutted by cartwheels and heavy hooves of oxen. Vile brown water stood in every runnel, pock, and divot. They were both dressed in local garb, or as near as Fraenk could estimate. Mud-brown trousers, mud-brown shirt, slop hats slung low on their brows, and cracked leather boots with holes worn through on the bottom. When Nim complained that they still stood out, Fraenk said he could roll in the mud if he liked to complete his disguise, which succeeded in shutting him up for a little while at least. "Well, if it's a kobold you want, I could get you one. Well, I could get you 2, even," Nim whispered after him. "I'm looking for just this one in particular, the fancy lad belonging to Lord Fernbrook. We could just dress one up in the fluff and finery. Old Fernbrook would never know the difference. He'd figure it out soon enough. Then what? We'd be long gone, safely back in Blackroot District, raising a hearty pint with the boys," Nim said with reckless confidence. "No, more like we're in the midst of a trade and the little bugger can't carry a tray, or tries to bite one of the elven maidens in the bumps, or drops a huge smelly scat on the floor like a dog. We're not putting our lives in the hands of a kobold," Fraenk snapped, leaping across where the planks were too far to step. Nim went quiet for a bit, and Fraenk could tell he was planning his next riposte. The light rain and time of night made Rounderville much more sedate than usual. There was still plenty of lights burning inside of the shacks and a few watering holes that had a lively, drunk crowd inside, but for the most part, the mud streets had few people out on the boards. Fraenk caught some glances from the residents, but none seemed to care or make any effort to hinder their progress. They could still hear the occasional shout or curse carrying in the air, but the chaos was at a safe remove. They passed an old man seated in a chair outside his shack, puffing a cloud of aromatic white smoke from a long-stemmed pipe. He nodded to Fraenk as they passed and squirted a black jet of tobacco spit into the mud. They stood aside to allow a chattering, foul-mouthed group of workmen, probably headed into the city for their shift. Fraenk made sure to duck his head in case they might recognize him, then carefully stepped around a drunk man who had passed out across the plank itself. Further down, a pair of naked toddlers burst out between them from the open door of a house and spilled, squealing into the muddy streets like a couple of happy piglets. Mama Sow emerged from the doorway after them, shouting and threatening to switch their hides raw, but to little effect. The children seemed to know she wouldn't follow them, and they giggled all the louder. Soon they reached the end of what Fraenk hadn't even realized were the nice houses, and moved into a grimier quarter of the slums. Here there were no planks to keep boots out of the mud, and the shanties could barely even be called that. They were loose boards hammered into rough rectangles, with large open holes everywhere that did very little to shelter from the elements. Fraenk could recognize by the stench that this was Kobold town. "See, Fraenk, we got all the way down here and you didn't even need me," Nim complained. "Just stay close and keep your eyes sharp. We haven't bagged the little dragon fart yet." They got reproachful looks from the Kobolds as they made their way down the muddy street, but none challenged their presence. Ahead, they approached a gathering of Kobolds, who were standing around a large cook-fire where a pot-bellied cauldron encrusted with the soot of countless flames contained a simmering of stewed meat and dark tubers, which were completely inedible to human digestion, all bubbling in a rich aromatic broth. A quartet of the creatures played a rough but melodic jig, two with crude homemade stringed instruments, and one tapped out a rhythm with sticks on pitched boards cut to differing lengths, and the last blew a jaunty bass note across the opening of an empty jug. This was some sort of communal evening meal. He knew he shouldn't be surprised, but Fraenk found himself in a quiet state of wonder. "Is this what they do?" Fraenk asked, immediately realizing it was a dumb question. "When the humans and elves aren't working them to death, yeah," Nim said, giving the musicians an appreciative nod. "I can't tell which is the one we're supposed to be looking for," Fraenk realized to his dismay. Why did he ever think this might be even a little bit easy? A group passed them, all clad in mud-stained cast-off rags that were in too poor of a condition for even the poorest humans. "I'll keep a sharp eye for the proper little guy in the fancy servant's uniform," Nim replied. "Listen to me," Fraenk shouted over the din. "Where is your leader?" Fraenk couldn't remember what they called their guy in charge. The music stopped, as did their conversations. No one answered. He only got sour looks from those nearby. "He's called the big man. It's like—" Nim made an odd guttural phonetic combination that Fraenk nearly confused with a clearing of the throat. "Something like that. My dragon tongue is pretty rusty." Fraenk tried again, asking and doing his best to approximate Nim's translation. All they got back were angry glares this time. One even spat at them. "I don't think I'm saying it right." Fraenk shrugged.
"Go away, human,"
an elderly voice croaked at them.
"Can't you smell? Don't want you here."
They turned to behold quite possibly the oldest kobold that Fraenk had ever seen. He had deep-set, slitted eyes and was encased in folds of wrinkled, scaly skin. One of his horns was broken off and the other was worn down to almost the same level. It made Fraenk immediately curious how old kobolds could get if allowed to do so, and not as so often the case, met with a violent end. That was their fault, though. Nasty creatures, always fighting and stealing and causing trouble. "We will leave, but answer our questions first," Fraenk said, taking control of the exchange. The old kobold sucked at his gums sourly, only a few rotted yellow teeth still fixed in his mouth. When he sighed in exasperation, 2 thin wisps of smoke jetted out of his nostrils.
"Well, go on,
he grumbled.
"We's busy. Go your questions."
"What's your name, big man?" Nim asked just as Fraenk was drawing a breath to begin his inquiry.
"Ah, so they does have the manners."
The old kobold crossed bony arms across a narrow chest. He nodded appreciatively at Nim.
"I sees you the big man. You call me—"
The old kobold made a noise that sounded like crackbone thackenswick. Nim tried to imitate the sound, but only make the old kobold wince painfully at the butchery of his sobriquet.
"Just say Kevin, like other humans."
"Kevin? What a dumb name," Fraenk whispered out of the side of his mouth. Nim almost burst out laughing, but quickly shushed Fraenk. The old kobold shot them both a dark look.
"His only name dumb human can say."
Kevin smirked. This one was sort of clever, Fraenk realized. "Very well, Kevin. We're looking for a fancy kobold. His name is Posu Faljaun." The old kobold didn't react, just continued to wheeze breath, puffing delicate grey clouds from his wrinkled nostrils. "We need his help. We can pay him," Nim tried. We can pay you if you tell us where he's hiding, Fraenk cut in.
No?
Kevin replied.
Can't say.
Fraenk noticed the other kobolds had quietly started to move closer, seemingly curious what this exchange was about. Despite their silent approach, the kobolds' ripe, odorous bodies growing more offensive to Frank's nostrils gave them up. You can't say, Fraenk pressed, or you won't.
Don't know Posu? He's not one of us.
Not one of you? He's a kobold.
Faraway Kobold. Not from Saharamati.
The way Kevin pronounced their kingdom took Fraenk a moment to understand. The kobold Posu Faljan wasn't a local. They didn't know him, and he probably didn't know them.
You think all kobolds know each other? Dumb human.
Kevin clicked his tongue, a chastising sound that apparently transcended all languages and cultures. It said, "Shame on you." Hells, Fraenk muttered, trying to think of what he would do now. Sir, Nim said, urgency in his voice. I know, Nim. We wasted a trip down here. You don't have to say it.
The other one asks same question,
Kevin said, matter of fact. What? What other one? Fraenk looked up, curious. The old kobold raised the hand that was tucked into his armpit. It was missing a pinky from the mid-knuckle. The scar was ruddy and already beginning to show the regrowth of a new digit. Sir, Nim said urgently. Fraenk looked around. All the kobolds had crept in, quiet as cats, and were surrounding them. The creatures were armed with shards of metal, whittled wooden spears, and clubs fitted with broken bits of glass.
The black mouth elf asks bad questions.
Kevin rubbed his hand. Black-mouth elf? Fraenk asked. You mean Bass Greenbrier? He was here? He asked about Posu? The old kobold sneered viciously.
We say not again.
I think they're going to kill us, sir, Nim exclaimed. Kevin, wait, Fraenk pleaded, grabbing for a pouch on his belt. The old kobold uttered a keening cry that was taken up by the rest of the group. We can pay you for your trouble. Just as Fraenk was raising the fat pouch of coins he had tied to his belt, the kobold just behind him stabbed with a jagged strip of sharpened metal. It sank deep into Frank's shoulder. The surprise and shock of it instantly made him cry out and lose his grip on the pouch. It tumbled end over end through the air, its drawstring loosening and spilling a galaxy spiral of iron, copper, and silver in the air. For one brief moment the sky shimmered with wealth. Then a rain of metal clattered off wooden roofs, stones, and kobold heads, ringing with the unmistakable chime of the mint. The kobold's coordinated attack was thrown into immediate chaos. Half scrambled to collect the scattered money that was even now being lost in the mud. The others still tried to jab their adversaries, but were being knocked and buffeted by the first group. Some of the kobolds rallied to give chase, but the delighted cheers of the treasure-seekers finding prizes quickly turned them back to scour for whatever coin remained. Go, Fraenk yelled, shoving Nim back the way they'd come. They ploughed past a trio of snarling kobolds, two of them scoring small punctures on Nim and Fraenk. The preceptors ran on, legs pumping to keep from getting stuck in the mud. Sir, they're still after us, Nim said, stealing a glance over his shoulder. They'll give up, right? Fraenk panted, hoping that was true. They ran on, moving faster now that they were back into the human quarter, but the kobolds did not give up pursuit and were actually gaining on them. I guess they're not giving up, Fraenk wheezed in dismay. Sir, I can't believe you did that. Nim puffed as they pounded along the planks. Throwing coins at those poor kobolds, that's just insulting. Well, I beg thee pardon, my lord. I was trying not to die, Fraenk said. He was holding the cut on his shoulder, trying to staunch the bleeding. All the running was beginning to tire him and awaken his bodily complaints. Nim, who had only minor injuries from a jab with a splintered stick, was out front of Fraenk. Well, some knowledge for the future, Nim continued, again checking to see that the kobold mob was closer still. Next time any gift of coin you hand to the elder, and he distributes it based on his own kobold criteria, Nim scolded. It shows respect that he's in charge. Next time I'll do that, Fraenk growled. And maybe next time you... Nim suddenly stopped in his tracks on the boards. Fraenk tried to stop in time, but skidded right into him. They both nearly toppled into the mud. The half-elf wore a terrified expression lit by yellow flickering torchlight. He was staring at something ahead of them on the path. The light grew brighter. On the planks ahead was a mob. Dozens of humans with lit torches carrying shovels, axes, meat cleavers, and even a few pitchforks. What mob would be complete without a few of those? They were coming up the street in a wave, blocking Fraenk and Nim's only exit. "Sir, it's a mob," Nim stated the obvious. "Really? Where?" Fraenk shot back, annoyed. The pursuing kobolds saw the mob too and skidded to a halt. They too did not like the looks of this wall of torch-bearing humans. Fraenk and Nim saw they were cut off now in both directions. They might try to take their chances with the half-dozen large kobolds with rusty metal shard knives, and would most likely die, but there was no way they were getting through a mob. The crowd moved closer until their apparent leader, a balding man with an ornate bandana across his brow, long beaded braids and a silver arrow-point chin beard, raised a fist and his torch over his head. The crowd came to a staggering halt. Fraenk could make out the constituents of this mob much better now, and did not like what he saw. It seemed to be composed of members of all the various gangs that haunted Rounderville, their various factions delineated by vaguely coordinated colours and styles. Offhandedly, Fraenk wondered if the matching outfits were planned or occurred naturally by virtue of a proximal fraternity, or it was more like a military uniform, no different than the elves peacocking around in their surcoats and sigils. A few moments later, the old kobold came riding up on the shoulders of two more stout kobolds, and followed by the remainder of his able-bodied kin, like some mockery of a great war general. "Sir, what now?" Nim whispered out of the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps this doesn't involve us," Fraenk suggested.
"These humans are our prisoners now,"
the arrow-pointed beard man announced to the kobold leader.
"Return to your homes or there will be battle."
The mob beat their weapons together and shouted, making a loud clamour.
Humans ours! Give us humans!
Old Kevin shouted, and his army hissed and screeched in reply. "You were saying?" Nim arched a sardonic eyebrow. Fraenk Neversleep had been in situations where the odds were against him, but he'd never had this many individuals all trying to kill him at the same time. "You know, I've not been this far out of Arathis in many, many years," Fraenk said. "That just occurred to me. I should have travelled more." Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.